Welcome to Unit 6, Lecture 2. This is over the respiratory system. You can use Chapter 21 of your textbook and your workbook. The specific pages are listed below. So our task list for this unit, first we're going to take some lectures over this lecture. Take notes. We're going to take some notes over this lecture. We're going to complete the Unit 6 homework assignment, Module 18 in specific. There is a creating a lung video and creating a lung video questions. I highly encourage you to watch this. This is actually something that many of my students have found very, very helpful. It's just a really silly, straightforward video that kind of shows how the diaphragm really contributes to you breathing. So please watch that. There's also the related quiz, which is the Unit 6 Quiz 2. So when we look at the respiratory system, mostly people think of the lungs, which is definitely a part of the respiratory system, but there are some other structures associated with it. So if you take a look at that picture over there to the right, what are some structures associated with our respiratory system? So if you're looking over there to the right, you see that we have our nasal cavity, pharynx, larynx, the trachea, and the lungs. A bronchus is also going to be part of that system. Those are just some structures. We'll dive down deep into these structures in just a couple of minutes here. Looking at the words below the picture, what is the function of our respiratory system? Yeah, so the respiratory system is going to keep blood constantly supplied with oxygen, and it's going to remove the carbon dioxide from the blood. So the main function, we're going to take a look at the lungs now, so you can see our lungs right on this page here. We have a left and a right side to our lungs. Now keep in mind, whenever we look at the organs of the body, you want to imagine it in an actual person. It's not always your right and your left. It's whoever's body these lungs are in, their right and their left. So just another little remember this all the way through anatomy here. So I have an A and a B outlined there. Your choices are either the apex or the base. So which one is A? Yep, A is going to be the apex. It's at the top. That's what apex means. Like an apex of a pyramid is the tip of the pyramid. So apex is the top. That would make B the base. So the base of the lung is at the bottom of the lung, and the apex is at the top. Now looking over there at the right lung, how many lobes do we have to the right lung? So if we look here, we have one here, another one here, and another one here. Therefore, we have 3 lobes to our right lung. How many does our left lung have? We have one here and one here. So our left lung has 2 lobes. So you can remember this this way, just like the heart, right? So in the heart, on the right side of the heart, there was the tricuspid valve, right? You know, on the right side, there's a tricuspid. So there was 3 valves, or 3 flaps to the valve. And on the left side of the heart, there was that bicuspid valve, which was 2. So if you can remember, the heart and the lungs are going to have a little bit of similarity, where you have 3 lobes on the right and you have 2 lobes on the left, just like the right side of the heart had the tricuspid valve and the left side of the heart had the bicuspid valve. Hopefully that's something that can help you remember that. Continuing to look at some structures to the lungs here, some landmarks that we have, we're going to look at some fissures. Now, we've talked about fissures in the past. Remember, like in the brain, we had some fissures going on. Hopefully you're like, oh yes, I remember a fissure and what it is. So what is a fissure? Yeah, it's essentially a deep groove in an organ. So a fissure is a deep groove. We have a couple of deep grooves or fissures in our lungs here. What fissures do we find in the right lobe of the lung? Yep, we find both the horizontal fissure and the oblique fissure. Remember where your right side is. Your right side is over here, so we can have that here. That's a beautiful star I just made. So we have over there in the right lobe a horizontal fissure and an oblique fissure. What fissures do we find in the left lobe of the lung? So left side is over here. Your left side is going to be our oblique fissure. So on the left side, we have an oblique fissure, and on the right side, we have a horizontal and an oblique fissure. So the way to kind of help you remember that there are less fissures on the left side, you can always remember left has less. So the left side has less fissures than the right side. And also the left has less in terms of number of lobes, right? The left side has left lobes as well. It only has 2 lobes and it only has 1 fissure. So hopefully that can help you out as well. So continuing to look at a landmark here, there's a big landmark that I haven't talked about yet, and it's this guy right here, and it's called the cardiac notch. So in what lung, the right or the left lung, do we find the cardiac notch? Yeah, it's on the left side, on the left lung, right? So the left lung, we see a cardiac notch. Looking at the word cardiac, why is there a cardiac notch in the left lung? Yeah, because that's where the heart is, right? It's a place for the heart to kind of nestle into. So we can see the little heart beating. It's going to nestle into the cardiac notch of our left lung. So heart is slightly on the left. So the left lung has to make a little bit of room for it. And it does it with that cardiac notch. All right, this is like the 4th time I'm trying to record this slide, so hopefully this time I get it right. Let me try this. All right, so we are now looking at a preserved specimen of the lung. We can see that over there to the left. We see that we have letter A up there. What is A pointing to? Yeah, it's pointing to the apex, right? To that tip, to the top of the lungs. We're looking at the apex here. Notice that we also have a hilum. The hilum is that circled region that you see over there on the picture. It's circled there. At a hilum, things are going to enter and leave an organ. A hilum is not specific to just the lungs, but it is a general area where things enter and leave an organ. So looking at that circled region, what all enters and leaves an organ at the hilum? Yep, so looking there, we see blood vessels and we see nerves. So we can see that the blue and the red are going to be the blood vessels, and that yellow tube is going to be the nerves. Now, this specimen has been dyed, that blue and that red, which is why it's so distinct. But that's what we see. We see the blood vessels and we see the nerves entering and leaving an organ at the hilum. We're going to see a hilum again later on in the semester. So if you go to page 471, you can actually circle where the hilum is at and label it just so that you know what we are talking about. So we have this double-walled membrane that surrounds our lungs. It's called the pleura. So it's called the pleura. If you remember from back in Unit 1, we actually had a pleural cavity, right? The pleural cavity was the cavity that the lungs are in. So we actually have pleura, which is the membrane that surrounds the lungs. What type of membrane is the pleura? Yeah, if you remember from our last unit, we also had a membrane like this, and it was a serous membrane. So this is a serous membrane. Where else have we seen a serous membrane before? Yeah, last unit we saw it on the heart, right? So we saw it on the heart there. What was the membrane around the heart called? Yeah, it was called the pericardium. So linking a couple of things together, pleura would be for your lungs, pericardium would be for your heart. Looking further at the pleural here, we can see that there's a type that actually touches the surface of the lungs, and then there's a portion that is more superficial. So looking at the two portions, we see we have a visceral pleura and we have a parietal pleura. Again, these words should sound very familiar. What portion of the pleural actually touches the lungs? Yep, that's going to be the visceral. And what portion of the pleural is most superficial to the lungs? That's the parietal. Remember, we've talked about this in the past. Visceral is very personal. It's all up on top of you. And your parietal is more superficial for you. All right, so now we're going to get into the respiratory system a little bit more. We're going to be taking a look at two different zones. I'm going to be referencing these throughout the lecture here, so you want to make sure you understand what's going on in these two different zones. First, we have the conducting zone, and then we have the respiratory zone. So CZ is going to be my shorthand for the conducting zone, and RZ is going to be my shorthand for the respiratory zone. So looking here, we have CZ over there. That guy is carrying a canister of some type of gas. And in the RZ, we have two rhinos who happen to be blue, who are taking carbon dioxide and oxygen and they're handing it off to each other. So looking at these two pictures, what is our difference between our conducting zone and the respiratory zone? Yeah, so in the conducting zone, you're just carrying the gases around. And in the respiratory zone, you're actually exchanging them. Okay, so in the conducting zone, you're just carrying the air around, you're just carrying the gases. And in the respiratory zone, you're actually exchanging the gases for each other. Okay, so keep that in mind. When I say gases, I want you to think of things like oxygen and carbon dioxide. Okay, so conducting, you're just carrying. Respiratory, you're actually exchanging. So first we're going to take a look at the nose. That is the most superficial structure, not superficial, the most, superior, there we go. The most superior structure of your respiratory system is going to be the nose. Notice here that we have the nasal concha labeled, so that's where we're at right here. We do have a superior, an inferior, and a middle nasal concha. Can you guess where they are? Yeah, if you remember directional terms, unlike me like 3 seconds ago, so if you remember directional terms, we have a superior, which would be the top one. We have an inferior, which would be the bottom one, and we have the middle one, which would be the one in the middle, right? So we have a superior would be the top nasal concha. Your superior one is this guy right here. Then you have your middle one, which is right in the middle, and then we have an inferior one, which is one on the bottom. So notice how we are in a CZ, right? So we're in a CZ, which means we're in a conducting zone, which just means we're just carrying the air. Okay, so that's what we're doing in this spot. But we do have mucosa in our nose. We know that we're a little mucusy up in there sometimes, all the time, actually, just more so in other times. So the mucosa of the nose is found throughout the surfaces of the nasal cavity. Okay, so we find that there. Thinking back, we always want to keep remembering things. What nerve would we find here? And we're going to find cranial nerve number 1, which is the olfactory nerve, right? So I have the olfactory there to help you. So the olfactory nerve is what we find here in the nose, in our nasal cavity. What type of epithelium would we find here? So this type of epithelium, it appears to be stratified, but it isn't. And they also have little hairs on them. I'll give you another hint. Here's a picture of it. So what type of epithelium is that? Yep, it appears to be stratified, but it isn't. So remember, pseudo means fake. This is pseudo-stratified columnar epithelium. So hopefully that is something that you're like, oh yeah, I kind of remember that. And we are secreting mucus in our body, in our nose, in our nasal cavity. So what type of cell would be secreting mucus in this region? Let me give you a hint. If you looked at that and you thought of a goblet, you are correct. So we have goblet cells that are going to be secreting mucus in our nasal cavity region. Right. Another structure that we see in the nose that we're going to discuss here is the nasal septum. So you can see the nasal septum in this picture over here to the left. What does the nasal septum do? Yeah, we see that it's separating the nose into 2 nostrils. So we have 2 nostrils because we have this chunk here that's separating it. Okay, so right here you can feel your nasal septum if you take your 2 fingers, your thumb and your first finger, and you just put it on the edge of your nose. You can actually feel that that tissue that the nasal septum is made of. Also keep in mind that when you look at a skeleton or a skull, you don't actually see a nasal septum there. So that's something to consider. So what type of tissue would our nasal septum be composed of? Yeah, if not bone, then it's going to be cartilage. So our nasal septum is made up of cartilage. It's slightly movable, very slightly movable, and we can see that it's not bone, therefore it's going to be our cartilage. Now we're going to take a look at the sinuses. Your sinuses are essentially little hollowed out areas in your bone that we find in the skull. We have 4 sinuses that we're going to be taking a look at: the maxillary, the ethmoid, the sphenoid, and the frontal sinus. What sinuses are going to do for us? They're going to assist in filtering, warming, and humidifying air that we inhale, making it a little easier on our body as the air enters our lungs. So that's what our sinuses are going to be there for. Looking at our choices and looking at A, B, and C, what sinus would A be? Yep, A is right by the frontalis muscle and also the frontal bone. A is going to be our frontal sinus. Told you guys, if you learn it once, you can remember it over and over again for different structures. What is B? Yeah, B is the ethmoid sinus, which is very close to your sphenoid sinuses. So if you think about your ethmoid and your sphenoid sinuses, if you take your thumb and your first finger and you place it on the bridge of your nose, this is typically where people, like if you see people take off their glasses and then rest their hand like on the bridge of their nose, they're touching the ethmoid and the sphenoid sinuses. Okay, so that's definitely something you see, especially with people who wear glasses, will be like, oh, you put your fingers right on those ethmoid and sphenoid sinuses. That leaves C, which is going to be our maxillary sinus. If you think about what bone you are close to with your maxillary sinus, you're very, very close to the maxilla. That's why it's called the maxillary sinus, because you're very close to your maxilla. So again, your sinuses are there to help filter, warm, and humidify air that we inhale. Looking at your sinuses, do the sinuses and the nose interact? Well, you can see it right here, especially with those maxillary sinuses. They're connected to the nose. So, yes, they are connected. You can see Captain Kirk there and Bones, the doc. They are telling you, yes, our sinuses and our nose definitely interact. You also know this because you've had colds before and you've had a cold in one side of your face for a little bit, like one part of your nose, you're like, oh my gosh, one nostril is completely consumed and the other is free. If you lay down on the side that's free, all of that nice little snot and stuff will go into the other sinus. So you know they're connected because it can go from one side of your face to the other. Now we're going to be taking a look at the pharynx. When you think of pharynx, I want you to think of your throat. Okay, so your throat, your pharynx are similar in their names. Okay, so throat / pharynx. What does A stand for? Yep, A is going to be your nasal concha, right? The nasal concha, remember we have a superior, a middle, and an inferior nasal concha. So that's what A is standing for. We have 3 different pharynx. We have a nasopharynx, an oropharynx, and a laryngopharynx. Your there you go. Your nasopharynx is going to deal directly with your nose. Your nasopharynx is found behind your nose, so that is going to be B, you're going to be your narrow nasopharynx. Ooh, that's very difficult to say. All right, the next one is your oropharynx. Oro means mouth, right? Oral or ora means mouth, so that is the pharynx that we find behind your mouth. So oropharynx is C. And laryngeal pharynx has to do with your voice box. Okay, so laryngeal is your voice box. Your voice box is going to be a little lower underneath your oropharynx. That is going to be D. If you have a hard time remembering that laryngeal has to do with your voice box, think of laryngitis. If you've ever had laryngitis, you cannot talk, right? So laryngeal should make you think of voice box because when you have laryngitis, you have a hard time talking. We are still in that conducting zone. We are still just carrying air around. So now we're taking a look at the larynx itself. Again, larynx, we're talking about the voice box region, the place where if you have laryngitis, you can't make any sounds. Okay, so that's where we're at. We're still in the conducting zone here. We can see bone A. So if you look at this picture to the left, you can see bone A. It's a free-floating bone. It's attached to no other bone. So what bone is A? Yes, it is the hyoid bone. Hopefully you remembered that one. So the hyoid bone was that free floating bone there. It's not attached to any other bone, and it's mainly there for muscle attachment. So when we look at this, we see this thing called a laryngeal prominence. You can see it on the picture to the left, and we also have it to this picture to the right, and I'll circle it. It is right here. What is another name for the laryngeal prominence? Yeah, it's typically called the Adam's apple. So we all have a laryngeal prominence, and we all technically have an Adam's apple. It's just easier to see on males than females. So we all have one, but it's there. One thing that I have circled over there is the thyroid cartilage. It's just something to remember. Your larynx is made up of this stuff called thyroid cartilage. The reason why it's called thyroid cartilage, you can probably guess, your thyroid is around that region. Okay, so that is one of the reasons why it's named that. So now we're going to take a look at two structures that we actually find in the larynx. We find the epiglottis and we find the vocal fold, which is also called the true vocal cord. If you look over at this picture to the right, we can see that the epiglottis is labeled here. This person in this picture is swallowing. As they're swallowing, we can see that this yellow structure here is going to be the trachea, and this blue structure in back is going to be the esophagus. Okay, so when we look at the epiglottis, we see from this little animation that it's essentially closing off our trachea so that food goes down the esophagus when we swallow. Okay, so your epiglottis is going to be blocking off that trachea during swallowing so that we only get food into the esophagus. Okay, we want the food in the esophagus. So that's what your epiglottis is doing. When you think about the actual name, the vocal fold or the true vocal cord, what will that vocal fold allow us to do? Yeah, it sounds pretty good, right? Like vocalization, right? It's going to let us make noises. So that's what our vocal fold is there for. So we've already looked at two structures of the larynx, and now we're going to look at one more. The last structure we are going to take a look at is the glottis. So we can see the glottis. Right here, the glottis is this area, this dark black area in our larynx. So essentially what we're looking at here, we're looking at the larynx and we're looking down on it. So we're looking down on the larynx. We can see the epiglottis, which is going to close off the trachea. We can see the vocal folds, which is going to allow us to make noises, and we have the glottis. Essentially, the glottis is an opening to the windpipe. Our windpipe is also known as your trachea. So it's an opening to your windpipe, and it allows air to flow. Okay, so it's essentially an opening, a hole. Now, your glottis is not always just a tiny little slit like it is in the picture above. It can also be like this picture over here to the right, which is kind of funny. Look at glottis goes from a little slit and then it opens all the way up. So your glottis is an opening, and that opening can be small or it can be wide, depending on how much air you need to get from your lungs out of your body or from outside of your body into your lungs. Now we are looking at the trachea. So we've gotten past the larynx and now we're looking at the trachea. Trachea, typically you would call this the windpipe. Okay, so the windpipe there. Notice how we have A, B, and C labeled. What do you think A is? Yeah, A is our esophagus. Your esophagus is behind your trachea. Okay, so your esophagus is behind your trachea. If you have a hard time believing me with that and you think that your esophagus is in front, if you've ever watched like movies or a TV show where they need to give someone, they call it like an emergency trach, and they like stab their throat with a pen or a pencil to get to the windpipe. If they were to stab this area and the esophagus was in front, the person that they're trying to get to breathe wouldn't be able to breathe, all right? It would just be in the esophagus, which leads to the stomach. I mean, that's not going to help, all right? So your esophagus is in back your trachea is in front. Okay, so please keep that in mind. What is B? Yeah, B is going to be our hyaline cartilage. So B is hyaline cartilage. Your trachea is made up of cartilage. Okay, so your trachea is made up of cartilage. This is again why you don't see a trachea on a skeleton, right? You don't see it on a skeleton because it's made up of cartilage. That leaves C, and C is going to be our ciliated pseudostratified columnar epithelium, just like we talked about earlier. We want to have that cilia as it's going down our trachea. The shape of our cartilage rings here, they look like a U when you look at them this way, but often they're referred to as C-shaped. So they are C-shaped rather than U-shaped. So that's just the shape of our cartilage rings. So looking at our trachea here, we want to know what substances go through the lumen. A lumen just means opening of the trachea. Hopefully, you just said air. Only air, all right? We don't want other things to go down our trachea, right? We don't want that to happen. If that does happen, it's because the epiglottis didn't do its job, all right? So air, we only want air to go down our trachea. Everything else, you want food, you want water to go down your esophagus. Okay. So remember that C was that ciliated pseudostratified columnar epithelium. We talked about this long ago in Unit 1. Why would it be good to have ciliated pseudostratified columnar epithelium? Yeah, because we want to remove particles that are bad from the air that we breathe in. So if you are breathing in this air that has a whole bunch of particles and all those particles make it into the air sacs of your lungs, that's a bad thing. Your ciliated pseudostratified columnar epithelium will capture those particles and they will bring them up. Remember, they're kind of like a little conveyor belts. They're going to be pushing all of those particles up to the back of your throat so you can clear your throat, swallow down all that bad stuff, and you're good to go. So that's why we have that ciliated pseudostratified columnar epithelium. If you look at this picture over here to the left, to the bottom left, this is a beautiful picture of this structure of our trachea. And you can see that it's lined with the pseudostratified columnar epithelium with those nice cilia so that we can get all the junk out of our lungs so it doesn't sit there and harm our lungs. Notice we're still in a conducting zone. We are still just carrying air around. So we are moving on from the trachea, and we hit this structure at the very end of it. What structure do we find at the very end of our trachea? Yeah, so we look at that little figure to the left here. We see that there is a carina. So carina is the structure that we find at the very end of the trachea. So carina means the keel of a boat. The keel of a boat, if you look at this picture of a boat, you can see it here. This is the keel of your boat, this area here. The keel of your boat, what it's going to do is it drives across water, is it takes water and it splits it onto both sides of the boat. Okay, so we're taking water and we're splitting it and then it goes to both sides of the boat. Knowing that that's what a carina is going to mean, it means a keel of a boat. What's going to happen at the carina in our lungs? Yeah, instead of splitting water on either side of a boat, it's going to split air into both the right and the left lungs. So the carina is there to help split air into our right and our left lungs. So looking at A, we just talked about this structure. What is structure A? Yep, it's the carina, right? The carina, the spot where we split air into the right and the left lungs. So looking at B, C, D, and E, we have a couple of options. So looking at the order in which these are running, B is going to be our primary bronchus. So we split from the carina to the primary bronchus. Notice how your primary bronchus starts to branch. It branches into C, which is our secondary bronchus. And then those branch into tertiary bronchus, and then those branch into bronchioles. So we have primary bronchus or bronchi. Bronchi is the plural. Secondary bronchi, tertiary bronchi, and then a bronchiole. So that's where we are. The parts of your lungs branch and branch and branch and branch and branch and branch and branch until they get to that final little area. Now notice we are still in a conducting zone. We are within the lungs and we are still just conducting stuff at this point. So we're still just moving air. We're just carrying it around. We haven't quite reached the spot where we're actually going to be exchanging gases. So we can see here, I just talked about this on the last slide, but all of these structures are still just bringing air into the body. No gas exchange is occurring yet. So is this a conducting zone or a respiratory zone? Yeah, this is a conducting zone still. So all of these areas, these primary, secondary, tertiary, and the bronchioles, those are still just conducting air. Now we've made it. We've made it to the respiratory zone, okay? So we've entered the respiratory zone. Remember those blue rhinos and how they were exchanging things, right? So what is going to happen here at the respiratory zone? Yeah, we're actually going to exchange gases. We're going to have gas exchange occurring. Remember, gas exchange means that we are taking oxygen and carbon dioxide and we are giving them to each other, okay? That is what's happening at a gas exchange. Now note, our alveoli themselves are the structures that will allow for the exchange of gases in the lungs, okay? So when we look at the bronchial tree here, remember that we just came from the bronchioles, and then we are going to go through the terminal bronchioles, and then to the respiratory bronchioles, then to an alveolar duct, then to an alveolar sac, then to the alveoli. Remember, your alveoli are the actual structures that exchange the gas. They're the ones that are actually going to do it. So I always think that alveoli sounds like ravioli, and maybe you exchange ravioli. No, but you exchange stories when you eat ravioli together. No, no. Okay, I tried. You got to give me some credit for trying. All right. I'm gonna erase these really fast, and then we will continue on. All right, so what structure allows for gas exchange in the lungs? Yeah, the alveoli, all right, the alveoli. Now, we have talked about alveoli just in a different word form. We called them the air sacs of the lungs, all right? So alveoli equals air sacs of the lungs. And we also talked about a tissue that the air sacs of the lungs were made of. So what kind of tissue are these alveoli made of? Yeah, they're made of simple squamous epithelium. So simple squamous epithelium, if you look here at this picture above, you can see that is simple squamous epithelium. That is another thing from back in the day. So that is also one of the reasons why our lungs are fairly easily damaged. if something is able to make it all the way down to the alveoli, they're now now encountering simple squamous epithelium. Simple squamous epithelium is not there to be strong, it's there to allow for the passage of oxygen and carbon dioxide. Okay, so we have those simple squamous guys down there, and they're going to help us exchange oxygen and carbon dioxide. So starting with the trachea, go ahead and follow the pathway of air throughout the bronchial tree. Okay, so starting with trachea, so trachea would be number one. Go ahead and follow how air would go through the tree. I'm going to give you about 10 seconds to pause this video, do that, and then you can check with me. So hopefully when you looked through your notes here, you were able to see the pathway. Starting with the trachea, we're going to go to the carina, right? The carina is where it splits. It then goes to primary bronchi, then to secondary bronchi, then to tertiary bronchi, then to bronchioles, right? So we have the trachea to the carina to the different types of bronchi to the bronchioles. Then we enter into the respiratory zone with our terminal bronchioles. Our terminal bronchioles become respiratory bronchioles, which become alveolar ducts, which become alveolar sacs, which become alveoli. Okay, so that is how air is traveling throughout our bronchial tree. It takes a while to get in there, and it all because of all of those branches. Right, so now we're going to take a look at the mechanics of breathing. So why does breathing happen the way that it does? The first thing we're going to take a look at is some chemistry. I'm sorry. It's only there to help you, I promise. All right, so we're only doing this to actually help you understand what's going on. So the first question asks, what happens to pressure as volume decreases? So we're going to take a look at first here. We see volume here is 1 liter, and we're going to bring the volume down to 0.5 liters. Okay, so we have 1 liter and we're bringing it down. So looking at what happens to pressure as we decrease the volume, we can see here that initially pressure is at 100 millimeters of mercury. And as we decreased the volume, it became 200 millimeters of mercury. So as our volume decreased, our pressure did what? It increased, right? So our increase in pressure is coming from a decrease in volume. Okay, so that's just something that we want to keep in mind. Now notice that this is kind of the same question, only in reverse. As pressure, what happens to pressure as volume increases? So if we were to look at it in the other direction, so we start out with 0.5 liters and we bring the volume up to 1. Looking at pressure this time around, we can see that pressure started at 200 and it has now gone down to 100. So pressure decreased when the volume increased. Okay, so we can see that there. This type of relationship, we call it an inverse relationship. That means when one of them goes up or down, the other one does the opposite. Okay, so as volume increases, pressure will decrease. As pressure increases, volume will decrease. This is an inverse relationship. This is important to know when it comes to your lungs. Okay, so when we talk about space, so volume and pressure, we will see how this works in your lungs very shortly. So the main structures related to breathing are the ribs, the sternum, our intercostal muscles, and our diaphragm. So I want to see what we can remember about each one of these structures. So there are 3 types of ribs. What are they and how many do we have of each? All right, so we do have three types. The three types are going to be our true, our false, and our floating ribs. We have 7 pairs of true ribs, 3 pairs of false ribs, and 2 pairs of floating ribs. Hopefully that's something that you kind of remember. What part of our sternum is the most superior? Good, that's going to be our manubrium, right? That manubrium was the most superior portion of our sternum. Which nerves serve our intercostal muscles? So that's going to be our thoracic nerves, right? Not a plexus. We only have our thoracic nerves there, so no plexuses, just that thoracic nerve. What nerve serves the diaphragm? Yep, that's going to be our phrenic nerve. Hopefully that's something you remember as well from that cervical plexus, right? Mainly, breathing would be a function of which? The autonomic or our somatic nervous system? Mainly, it would be autonomic. Mainly, breathing is automatic, right? Normally, you aren't like thinking about breathing, you just do it normally. So mainly it's a function of the autonomic nervous system. However, it can be part of your somatic nervous system because sometimes you do control how much you're breathing. Like when a doctor is like, breathe in now, you're controlling when you're breathing in. So now we're going to take a look at inspiration. Inspiration is just when we breathe in. So looking at the figure here to the left, what happens to the ribs and the sternum as we breathe in? So you can see their ribs are going to elevate and the sternum expands. Okay, so that's what we're doing here. Our ribs elevate and our sternum expands. You can feel that when you breathe in. Your sternum expands out and your ribs are going upwards. So you can definitely feel that. What happens to the diaphragm as we breathe in? So looking again at the most inferior portion of that picture, we can see that our diaphragm is moving inferiorly, which means it's moving down. So our diaphragm is moving down as we breathe. So if we think about what's happening here, we are taking our ribs and we're elevating them and our sternum is going outward. We are moving that huge muscle, the diaphragm, down. So the volume in our lungs is actually going to increase. So we're going to have more volume in our lungs. So now we're going to use Boyle's law to kind of help us understand what's going on in terms of pressure and volume. So we know that as we breathe in, the volume of our lungs increases. So what's going to happen to the pressure in our lungs? Yeah, it's going to decrease, right? So as the volume increases, the pressure is going to decrease. Looking at the picture over there to the right, we can see the pressures outside and inside our lungs. So outside of our lung is here, the 760 millimeters of mercury, and inside of our lungs we see it here. So we have two different pressures, here and here. So which is higher, the pressure in the lungs or the pressure outside of the lungs? Yeah, the pressure outside of the lungs is higher, right? 760 is more than 757. So knowing, we've got to remember some good old biology here. We want to remember that things always move from where there's more to where there's less. Okay, so things always move from high to low concentrations. They move from where there's high to where there's low amounts. So knowing that, which way will air travel? Will it go in or out of the lungs? Yeah, air is going to travel into the lungs. So looking at that picture above again, you'll see these 3 circles pop up. We're going into the lungs. So we're bringing in air because the pressure outside of the lungs is greater than inside the lungs. Therefore, it's going to go in. Okay, so we always want to remember things are going to go from high to low concentrations, and there's more pressure on the outside, therefore it will go in. So with expiration, essentially the opposite is going to happen. So that's just a little bit of help there. Expiration is just breathing out. So what happens to the ribs and the sternum as we breathe out? So we can see they depress, which means they go inward, which you can definitely feel when you, blow out air. Anytime you expire, you can feel they go in, they depress in. What is happening to the diaphragm as we breathe out? Yeah, it's moving superiorly, which means it's moving up. So we can see that we are pushing down on the lungs, and we are also pushing the diaphragm up. So when we think about what's happening to the volume of the lungs, we're pushing down and we were pushing up. We are making them smaller. So that means the volume of our lungs is decreasing. Okay, so when we expire, we are decreasing. So again, remembering Boyle's law, as the volume of our lungs decrease as we expire, what happens to the pressure in our lungs? Yeah, it's going to increase. So we're having an increase in pressure here. So looking here, we have outside of our body, it's 760, as it will be most of the time. On the inside, we see 763 for our pressure. So which is higher, the pressure in the lungs or the pressure outside of our lungs? Yeah, the pressure in our lungs is actually higher, right? So in our lungs is actually higher. Again, things always go from where there's low to where there's high concentration. I'm sorry, nope, the other way around, from high to low concentration. So things always go from high to low concentrations. So which way is air going to go? Yeah, it's going to go out, right? So we can see little arrows, little circles around them. We're going out because we're going to go from where there's 763 millimeters of mercury to 760. Okay, so that is why we will expire out our air, because air is going to travel from where there's high concentrations to where there's low concentrations. All right, we made it to the end of this lecture here, so make sure to do your homework, which is the Unit 6 homework assignment, Module 18. To help you understand, please watch that Creating a Lung video and complete those questions. Again, I just think it's really, really helpful, so if you can do that, go ahead and do that. And then, of course, your related quiz is a Unit 6 Quiz 2.